So it turns out that when you're making a video about getting rid of most of your paints, everyone just wants to send you more paints to try. And did you know that Vallejo redid their entire model color range? Well, neither did I, but here we are. I guess someone needs to increase their marketing budget. I'll probably do a raffle and give most of these away because, as you know, if you watch the video, I already have my core ranges of paints. But while I have them, I thought I might as well try a few of them simply to be caught up on what is out there. And one thing you already know if you're a regular of this channel is that I have some very particular opinions about metallics. And that's why I own a grand total of 4 of them. Of course, that's not because I hate metallics. No, I really enjoy painting with them, but I genuinely think that that is all you need to create every metallic tone you'll ever need. I already explained that in a couple of other videos, but Army Painter here put a lot of innovation into their new paints, and there also is a bloody lot of new metallics in there. So I was curious what they'll be able to do, what new properties they have, and most of all, how these paints would fit into my personal painting style. And maybe they don't fit into it at all, and this is the first and last time I use them. So let's see what these paints are all about and what new tricks I might be able to learn from them. I had these Dark Oath Warriors assembled from a video that didn't happen a while ago, and since they have a ton of different metal surfaces, they would make for some great subjects to test the metallics on. But before that, I took the time to paint them up properly because obviously if I wanted to see how both the Fanatic metallics and the speed paints would perform in a realistic situation, that meant I would have to paint some half-decent minis before I could begin my test instead of just slapping them over some base-coated features without the context of a proper paint job. I primed one of them black, which is usually the way to go if you are using a lot of metallics, and I gave the other one a Senator white base coat over black because, of course, it is recommended to apply the speed paint metallics over a white or gray base coat. I wanted to use a lot of the warm metal tones, gold, copper and brass on this guy, so I decided to keep the whole composition in warmer tones. Mixing a red-brown base color for the skin and also keeping the midtones warm using a sunny skin tone type color, and only introducing colder colors on these brightest highlights, giving it a more blue skies daylight feeling. I'm keeping the leather parts in line with the overall warm tones, but I sneak in some bluish highlights on the black leather that fit with the colder highlights of the skin. One of the tricks of color theory is that you can introduce a lot of different colors as long as you mix them with one of the predominant colors on the Mini to draw everything together. So here I mixed burnt umber that I already have in the shadows of the leather with turquoise as a base color that I gradually made brighter. Mostly blocking in colors and then drawing them together with stippling and microtexture, using very small lines mostly. For Patrick Bateman here, I decided to use the white base coat to my advantage and started by blocking in a dark pinkish skin tone, leaving the areas that would eventually be brighter so I could paint the highlights directly over white, which will make them more vibrant. And this is what I mean, you can see how the paint goes on more or less opaque and how bright it ends up being. And once that's done, it's easy to use a mix of the two colors to create a blend between them by simply working over the sharp transition line and smoothing it out. Just like with Chubby Rock, I'm adding a bluish tint to the highlights, so they would fit together on the table, even though this Mini would be composed mainly of bright colors, bright skin tones, silver and shiny gold metallics. To make them appear even more coherent, I also used some of that same turquoise and umber mix I used on the first Mini to create the base mix of the loincloth. It just made it a lot brighter. Maybe this is some old and sun-bleached fabric to go with the brighter color scheme. You'll be able to find a full step-by-step video guide for both these figures on my Patreon and in the YouTube members section. I'll also prepare and upload a PDF, so if you want to learn some new tricks for skin tones, that's 2 resources that should help you out with that. But for this video, I really wanted to focus on these metallics and what they can do, so I'm keeping this section short. And like I said, there is a lot of metallic paints in the new Army Painter War Paints Fanatic range, so I decided to cut it down a bit and focused on a dark silver, one of the bronze copper colors, and one of the yellow gold, as well as the desaturated tainted gold. And that turned out to be one of my favorite colors for metallics, and will definitely make it into a lot of my recipes for metallics moving forward. But let's take it step by step. I started with weapon bronze over black, and while the first layer still looks a bit dull, once I added a second layer and all the black was properly covered, the intensity and reflectiveness just blew me away. From conversations with the good people at Army Painter, I gathered that these paints have mixes of mica and ground up aluminium to create the blend of coverage and shininess, unlike a lot of other colors that mainly use aluminium or mica. Mica is a silicate mineral. Think about the shiny component in granite, and as far as I know, you can add a color to mica, but not really to aluminium. So whenever we see these intense colors, that could have been achieved with colored mica dust, while aluminium is mainly there to create a strong reflectiveness. But as far as I know, you can also coat aluminium with iron oxide to create, for example, gold colors. And you can also grind up copper and zinc and mix it with aluminium to get similar effects. Or you can just add pigment to the medium everything is suspended in to achieve color, which is something that will happen in speed paints because they only have aluminium, simply because you cannot have mica in it, as that would create stains and smearing. And all of this gave me a bit of a headache, and I decided to move on without trying to provide all of that background information for each individual color, because ultimately for me the only thing that matters is how the paint behaves and what the results are. What this does explain though is why some metallics, especially golds in my experience, go on so much different and feel a lot worse as far as coverage goes, for example, than silvers or bronze colors. Here I'm using Tainted Gold, and I'll go out on a limb without really knowing that this is mainly mica, because it needed 3 or more layers in some places to get an opaque layer of paint done. Sometimes we talk about quality versus bad quality paints when it comes to metallics, and as a first impulse I would qualify this paint as worse quality than the weapon bronze. This paint at first didn't feel as good to work with, but ultimately I think it all comes down to balancing color, reflectiveness and opaqueness with tools that these companies have available. And with some tones I think it is just more difficult to hit all these 3 aspects equally, and that's also why especially ranges that have a lot of different colors sometimes feel so inconsistent. Well then, besides being a bit complicated, that was actually pretty fun to research. It always got me a little bit excited and happy, so I guess it's time to end the video on a high note. Keep pushing that pigment and I'll see you in the next. Okay, just kidding. So my plan with the Tainted Gold was to create a form of lighter bronze that I could stain with some verdigris. For the sword I used plate mail metal, as I'm going to add some washes of regular acrylics to add mattness, but also to darken some parts that I could later contrast with a highlight of a brighter metal color. As a last color variant, I added the greedy gold to this little round plate and the sword handle, and I painted the pauldrons and the braces in weapon bronze again. And all of these colors look like solid bases, only the tarnished gold taking a few layers more to end up as an opaque layer. So far so good. All these colors are nice to work with, they're decently thin, there's none of that gunkiness going on that you get with some other metallics, which gives me hope for the highlight process later on to go rather smooth. And still, most of them go on in 2 coats, which is a massive time saver when using metallics. The metal flakes are small, like some other metallics build up that gritty texture because the flakes are just so large. These here remind me a lot of my favorite metallics, the Vallejo acrylic metal colors for airbrush, and I also do like the final color results and the reflectiveness that we get with these. Oh, and if you enjoy painting metallics as much as I do, I have a fantastic recommendation that will give you tons of opportunity to use the tricks you learn from this video when creating your own pirate warband. Port Royal has been described as more time set in the Caribbean, only better. A dynamic, campaign-based, narrative-driven skirmish game set after the historic 1692 earthquake that devastated the island of Jamaica. Play as one of 7 factions, each with their own set of rules and abilities that will aid you in your quest to seek treasure and fortune in the ruins of the city. Pick a captain and build a crew around them, and off you go into the city of Port Royal. The game has an intriguing campaign mode where the outcome of one game affects any further encounters down the line. Characters killed are removed from your roster, injuries sustained influence them and alter their abilities and usefulness in future games. Experience gained will make them more proficient in plundering and disposing of your opponents. And any treasure grabbed will buy you new crew members and better equipment. Port Royal has has an active and reactive gameplay where any of your actions can trigger a reaction by your opponent. This keeps games fast-paced and fun, and you always have to stay on your toes if you want to claim your share of the plunder that Port Royal has to offer. Firelock Games is making historical games fun and accessible to a wide audience, and they just finished another successful Kickstarter campaign with Port Royal. They unlocked all of their fantastic stretch goals, and you can still grab this gem of a game through their backer kit that will go live in a few days. Just sign up to be notified on the website linked in the description. Before we continue, let's also see how the speed paint metallics behave. Again, I picked the most commonly used colors, starting with broadsword silver. I covered the axe in one generous layer, and you can really see how the paint moves around on the surface, and trying to settle in recesses and leaving the white base coat exposed on the edges. I gotta say, I was really skeptical about the idea of using a contrast or speed paint type approach for metallics. But for something simple like an axe, this here doesn't look too bad. You get this dark area here and in the recesses where more of the paint accumulated, and the edges look shiny, and this is a great initial definition of the shapes. I also tried it on more complicated features, and again the result was surprisingly good, considering this is just one layer of paint. Next up I tried Horde Bronze, and here I ran into a problem. A separation of the various elements of paint bottles is nothing new, and everyone knows that with a lot of shaking you can usually get the paint back in shape. However, I was shaking this one for 3 minutes straight and it still wasn't mixed together. So I opened it, mixed it thoroughly and shook it again, and somewhat got it to work. But then I was putting it down for half a minute and everything was separated again. And I'll be honest, once a paint is that much effort to get to work, I don't really consider it an option anymore. So at this point I tried all of them to see if they have the same problem, and I ran into some trouble with brazen copper and enchanted steel. Glittering loot and polished silver had a similar problem, but I'll give them a pass because they eventually mixed up to where they were usable at least. But yeah, here you can see how Horde Bronze goes on, and I'm pretty sure it is not supposed to have these very dark streaks. So it looks like that's the medium, so the binder, some solvent and probably some pigment or any combination of these, not properly mixed and just settling in the recesses and making them darker. Ironically, it looked like the base color and an initial wash to darken the recesses applied all at once. And I wonder if maybe that was the intention, although I really doubt it. I tried glittering loots on the shield, and just like the broadsword silver on the axe, I think this did work out surprisingly good. There's contrast and definition, and again I'm wondering if the binder separating and darkening the recesses more is intended. I also like how the individual segments also did get some surface definition. There's a gradient from dark to light there that usually takes some layers of glazing to do. On the table this probably looks very decent without any further treatment, and I guess if you didn't like painting at all and just wanted your army painted, this would work as a one layer and done metallic. Of course you can make it prettier by maybe dry brushing a highlight color over it, or like I do here, use a thinned down metallic paint to go over the raised areas so they look less white and more like actual reflections, which is my biggest gripe here. If you look at it close up, you see that it's not the metallic highlight, but white shining through and making it brighter. But if I want to go beyond just one layer of paint and I have to invest more time into making them look better, I'm asking myself, why not use a regular metallic to begin with? It doesn't really matter what base metallics you use. I guess this can come in handy if you start all your minis from a sanded cell white base coat, then you don't have to deal with regular acrylics being all streaky and not covering over white properly. Metallics almost always go on better over black primer. So ultimately, the question that remains to be answered is whether this product is just for people who want to invest a minimum of time into painting, or if it has some other usages beyond that. And let's move on and see if I came up with anything. But before that, let's invest some more time to make all of these metallic elements a little prettier. So let's go back to Chubby Rock. I needed to shade all the metallics and knock the intense shine back in some areas to make the metals look more credible and in scale. So for the brass shield, I went for some verdigris using a mix of burnt umber and turquoise, this time a brighter one, and I just washed this mix over all of the shield. It settled in the recesses and made them darker, but also built that greenish weathered tint that is so typical. And it also dulled down a big portion of the shield, so I could later selectively build back the shine for some extra contrast. I darkened the lower half of the shield a bit more with some thinned down burnt umber and added a thin layer of sienna to create a bit of color variety and a shadow effect. I also used that mix to build some depth on the more detailed parts that I base coated with weapon bronze. And contrary to these detailed features, like the plate on the belly, when shading these flat parts we need to direct the pigment a bit more instead of just slapping it on and have it settle in the recesses. What you can see me do here is that I'm pushing the pigments downwards on that big shape of the pauldron, so the raised area still remains shiny and reflective. The sword has two edges that both face different directions, and also one of them is facing our zenithal light source more than the other, so I'm using a mix of dark gray and brown to shade these accordingly. Now with all parts shaded, it is time to bring back the shine on some elements. And what I'm looking for in a highlight color for metallics is whether it fits the tone of the color, if it gives a bright reflective shine, and whether or not it is thinnable yet consistent enough not to produce any grainy results. And for all of these non-silver metal paints, Tainted Gold had all of that. It fits both yellow and the more reddish and brown tones in the copper really well. And as you can see, it is dilutable to a very fine layer while still retaining the reflectiveness. Often we are tempted to use a silver color to highlight metals like these, simply because all other options just have colors that are too gaudy and won't fit, and then we're stuck with a good reflectiveness, but the highlights just feel completely alien and out of place since the colors don't match. Here on the bronze pauldron, the Tainted Gold creates a very yellowish highlight that I like a lot. And it also worked really good on the more detailed belly plate. To highlight the sword, I used mithril, and I gotta say this checks all the boxes mentioned before of what I'm looking for in a highlight color. And it's probably the closest to my usual bright aluminium Vallejo highlight color that I use on all metallics. It creates a great shine and it's fine enough to build this micro detailing of scratches and dots that make the metal look structured and alive. So moving back to Patrick here, after shading the steel parts the same way, you can see that the speed paint metallic almost looks a bit purple. But otherwise, after this step, you can't really see whether or not that was a speed paint base coat. And especially after I applied a couple of highlights, this was indistinguishable from regular metallics. I did try the speed paint metallics as a highlight color, but the truth is I don't think they are very suitable for that due to their formulation. There's just too many things in there to make it work as a contrast style paint for it to qualify for my 3 standards mentioned above. There's no really bright tones, polished silver among the silver colors being the brightest one, and just compare that to how bright the mithril of the Fanatic paints is. To use an analogy, in non-metallic metal, we want to paint our brightest reflections in whites and not in a mid-tone gray. So the speed paint metallics are a very specialized product. The medium that makes them work as a contrast paint also makes them spread out somewhat inconsistent, and it also makes them a bit gunky and thicker than the regular Fanatic paints. So my final verdict on these speed paints is that they are a bit hit and miss when it comes to what they are supposed to do. Remember when I talked about that built-in shade effect? I don't know if that's supposed to be there, and some have it more and others have it less. But those that do work are great for that one layer and done approach, and if you're using a lot of zenithal priming, they might speed up your first layers, but they don't offer much for someone like me that wants a bit more versatility from the paints that they own and also wants to invest a bit more work into the final result anyway. It isn't just all about speed. Speaking about that, let's finish out this test by trying to make Patrick over here pretty. And I started that endeavor by tinting the shield elements. Here I use a couple of thin layers of burnt sienna, and this is the burnt umber and turquoise mix that I already used. I followed this up by some pure burnt umber to darken the shadows, and then added more glazes of color to the panels, adding variety. Finally, I placed some edge highlights with my new favorite metallic paint, Tainted Gold. First, I defined all of the edges and then thinned it down even more and glazed over the areas I wanted highlighted. Not only does the paint blend in smoothly while bringing back the shine on these matted down surfaces, it almost looks like the paint adapts to whatever base color you have. Like this is a more light gold surface and the highlight itself looks more bright and whitish. While on these bronze pauldrons, the tint appears more yellowish over the reddish brown base color. Magic. So war paint fanatics metallics, definitely a recommendation from me. If you do not own metallics that work for you already, these will give you great results. Whether you want to be quick or you need some metallics for your golden demon entries, great variety of colors, great properties, and a lot of versatility. There's only one thing left to do. Let's look at the final results. Thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment and tune in again next time.